Intangible, speaking for the unspoken. Born in Michigan, July 24, 1969, she looked to the stars as a child and discovered more than comfort in the silence. Abuse creates the recluse, and her environment made her run. September 23, 2022, it stopped her in her tracks. She had collected enough puzzle pieces, and her time to make the intangible tangible was now upon her. They only make statues of crazy people. I'll take that challenge. Just as there are readers and writers, there are the religious and the spiritual. What some may call God, consciousness, universe, or true self, I call it life. From divine predictions to bilocation and everything in between, life leaves clues to guide us on our journey. I recall choosing this lifetime, knew it would be difficult, but knew it would be worth it. Within is the best place to be. Here is my story. Heather. I believe it was toward the end of October, about 15 years ago, maybe 2006 or 2007. I was living in Brighton at the time, in the first home I purchased on my own, in a neighborhood that has since been replaced by the I-96 and US 23 interchange. It was early morning, still very dark outside, when I was awoken with a knowing of Heather. A passing image of her moved from right to left as the thread of information came to me, is the best I can describe it. It told me that breast cancer came back and took her quickly. I wasn't sure why I was knowing this, as I hadn't heard much about Heather in many years, other than she had married, had 2 young boys, and had thankfully beaten breast cancer a few years prior. Heather was the younger sister of my childhood best friend. I say and feel I mostly grew up at their farm, avoiding my own home, with all 3 of us girls sleeping under the same blanket for warmth. They had 5 children of their own, and I suppose in some ways they viewed me as number 6. Even though I never let on much about my home life, my best friend caught wind of something going on that I chose to deny, and I suppose that probably solidified my position in their home. Knowing is something I'd become accustomed to, and generally I'd immediately confirm, because knowings are awesome and I love blurting them out, just waiting for the first time when it's wrong. But this was obviously different. How do you confirm this one? Call my best friend, who at the time lived in Texas, with Heather up here in Michigan? Did she even know? Did anyone know yet? Historically, my knowings are immediate, in that moment, or I state them with a future date. This was a delicate one, and my mind struggled with, "Hey Kirsten, have you heard from Heather lately?" Or, "Hey, how's Heather?" But those didn't sound right either, because I never asked about her the infrequent times we did talk. And if I was wrong, what a horrible thing to say or tell someone. I'd make her worry unnecessarily, and if it were true, I'd find out soon enough. So I opted to not say anything and followed the obituaries for several days, searching to see if there was any mention online I could find. But nothing. This nagging feeling kept after me for over a week. After about 10 days, it dissipated, allowing me to focus on the things I needed to. A couple days afterwards, maybe 2 weeks after I knew, and approximately a week into November, the phone rang. Surprisingly, it was Kirsten, as we didn't talk as often since we grew up, each living our own lives. Yet not so surprisingly, she called to let me know Heather died. I took a deep breath and sadly yet solemnly said, "I know." That was about all I could say, as the tears and knowing held my throat closed. Everything else I'd tossed around in my head for so long just didn't seem right. Unfortunately, my response upset her. I immediately placed myself in her position of having to make such calls, those that nobody wants to make, especially at such a young age. Heather was only in her mid-30s. "Why didn't you tell me you knew?" she demanded. I knew she was hurting, and I didn't have a response other than the truth, even if she didn't want to believe me. "How could I tell you?" I blurted out as I ran through what was in my head, but I could tell she didn't quite believe me. Even with everything else she knew, I suddenly felt like she never fully believed me about any of it. And now that it was closed to her, how could she? Why should she? I don't recall her ever getting around to the details, whether the cancer came back and took her or if it was something else, exactly how long ago she had passed on, or even when the funeral was. She was upset, and upset with me for telling her I knew. While other things had come between us over the years that I had tried to ignore, I could feel that this was it for her, the end of our lifelong friendship, and there was nothing I could do about it but listen as the phone went silent. We hadn't met or talked for long, maybe a few days at that point in 2021, and I hardly knew anything about him when I started seeing images in the layers of gray when meditating. I drew out what I saw, meditated again, drew, meditated, drew. It was an odd combination, and because the images were coming at me so regularly and being so cooperative, I really wanted to make sense of it. Water, big water. Then something over the water, but I could only see so far. A pier, I presumed. As if to answer me, my focus zoomed in on the detail of the structure over the water, which wasn't wood as I would have expected a pier to be, but metal that crossed on the uprights as if for structural support. Lastly, I saw a woman's hand picking white daisies in a field. Since the images were new to me, and this guy was also, I considered who else I knew I could send a photo of these images I drew. I hadn't really seen actual images in the layers of gray before, other than distinct triangles or squares that I'd either focus on or let glide by, let alone ones wanting to make sure they were known, one after another. I really wanted to understand this phenomenon. I'd asked a spiritual friend if any of it made sense or related to him, but it did not. So I asked this guy I barely knew, would he think I was crazy? Maybe, but whatever. Well, I knew he was Canadian. He told me he was driving or had just arrived back in Canada, which means, based on where he was, he had just crossed the Ambassador Bridge. For those unfamiliar, the bridge has crossed uprights and is made of metal. He was heading there for his mother's funeral and advised he had lost his father weeks before also. Wow. He seemed close to them, and I felt horrible asking about my meditation visions, but I immediately Googled what picking daisies meant and found in Norse mythology, daisies were symbolic with motherhood. The following day or so, he sent me a picture of himself and family members of his family while in Canada, but my eyes focused in on a bouquet of pale pink oxeye daisies sitting on the table behind everyone. Not the same daisies I saw in my vision, but daisies nonetheless. I asked if he bought them, and he said no, he hadn't even realized they were there. I accepted then that it was his mother who was being so persistent, knowing I was talking to her son, knowing I was open to receiving, and wanted to let him know she was there. Could it be he was spiritually open as well, and I was picking up on his thoughts? Quite possibly. But the persistence and recalling how mediums say the dead are persistent leads me to believe she was communicating with me. And that's probably why our paths crossed to begin with. I inserted an image of the text in December where I had said, I'm writing a book about my lifelong experiences, and apparently the images of the water and the pier, bridge, and daisies on your way to your mom's funeral wanted to be included. I just finished writing that story. It's the 9th one I've written so far, with a list of many more to go. Not sure what order they will be in the book, but this story is called Daisies, in Norse mythology equals motherhood. The book is called Intangible, Speaking for the Unspoken, and I hope to have it written and published by January. Have a great holiday. He replied, great to hear from you. We've talked about high planes, levels of consciousness, and this is a real life example that blows my mind. I was actually thinking about you today, first time in a while, and here you are reaching out. Secondly, you talk about my mom's funeral, and I actually drove over to Chatham in Canada and spent time with my parents' gravesite today. Coincidence? I don't think so. I know we connected on a higher plane level, and you reached out.